For 25 years, travelers vanished on Scotland's coastal roads, but authorities blamed storms and bandits. What they discovered in 1615 was so horrifying that even hardened executioners vomited. Inside a seaside cave lived something that shouldn't exist in civilized society. But how did an entire bloodline become this twisted? Something was hunting people along Scotland's Ayrshire coast in the 1500s. Nobody knew what. They just knew that travelers who set out on perfectly normal journeys never made it home. The disappearances started slow. A merchant here, a farmer there, but then the pattern got worse, and locals began whispering about robbers hiding in the hills. Makes sense, right? Highway robbery was common enough back then. What didn't make sense was how thorough these robberies were. The victims vanished completely, leaving behind no witnesses, no survivors, and definitely no stories. Suspicious villagers started pointing fingers at innkeepers along the coastal roads. Poor bastards couldn't catch a break. Every time someone went missing after staying at their establishments, angry mobs would show up demanding answers. The innkeepers had none to give, but fear makes people stupid. Several innocent business owners got run out of town, or worse, all because they happened to be the last people to see the disappeared alive. Then there's the really weird part. Bodies started washing up on the shores, and they weren't pretty sights. These weren't drowning victims or people who fell off cliffs. The corpses were missing arms, legs, sometimes entire torsos. The remaining pieces showed clear signs of violence, hair cuts that looked deliberate, methodical even. Local authorities scratched their heads. What kind of robbers butchered their victims like livestock? Night travel became a group activity out of pure terror. Merchants organized convoys. Families traveled in packs. Even the bravest souls refused to walk the coastal paths alone after dark. The strange thing was, it didn't always help. Sometimes entire small groups would vanish together, leaving behind only scattered belongings and hoof prints that led nowhere. Well, technically the prints led somewhere. They just stopped at the rocky coastline where the sea met jagged cliffs. Search parties would find abandoned horses, overturned carts, and personal items scattered across the ground like breadcrumbs. But the people, gone without a trace. Local dogs refused to hunt in certain areas along the coast. They'd whine, tuck their tails, and bolt in the opposite direction when their owners tried to lead them towards specific stretches of shoreline. Animals know things humans don't, and these dogs were screaming warnings nobody understood. The killings went on for years. Decades, actually. Families moved inland. Trade routes shifted away from the coast. Entire villages became ghost towns as people fled whatever evil had claimed that stretch of Scottish shoreline. Authorities organized search after search, combing the hills and forests for bandit camps or robber hideouts. But nobody thought to look where the real danger lived. Nobody suspected that the answer lay hidden beneath their feet, in places where the tide came and went twice daily, washing away footprints and covering all traces of the truth. The predators weren't hiding in the hills at all. They were much closer than anyone imagined. And their story was about to become Scotland's most horrifying legend. Alexander Bean wasn't your typical dropout from society. Most people who flee civilization might build a cabin in the woods or maybe join a monastery. Not Sawney. He found himself a sea cave along the Scottish coast that was basically nature's perfect hideout. The entrance flooded completely twice a day with the tide, making it nearly impossible for anyone to stumble across accidentally. Pretty clever for a guy who probably couldn't read. This wasn't some shallow cave either. We're talking about a deep, winding tunnel system that stretched nearly a mile underground. The Beans could hear the ocean crashing above them, but down in their depths, they were completely cut off from the world. And that's exactly how they liked it. Here's where things get really twisted. Sawney brought along a woman when he fled society, and together they started what you might generously call a family. Except this family had some serious problems with their family tree. The Bean clan grew to around 45 people over the years, but they weren't exactly welcoming new members from the outside. Makes sense, right? Hard to keep your location secret when you're constantly bringing in fresh faces. Instead, the family kept things strictly in-house, if you catch my meaning. Brothers, sisters, parents, children, the usual family boundaries didn't exist for the Beans. The result was a clan of people who were, let's say, not quite right in the head. Generations of this kind of thing tends to produce some pretty disturbing individuals. But here's the really impressive part about their setup. They managed to stay completely hidden for 25 years. Think about that. 25 years without a single person discovering their cave. They became masters of the night, only emerging when darkness fell to hunt for their next victims. During the day when normal people were going about their business, the beans were fast asleep in their underground lair. The tide schedule became their natural security system. Anyone trying to follow them back to their cave would find the entrance completely underwater. And even if someone did manage to time it right during low tide, who's going to wade into a dark, flooded cave mouth just on a hunch? Their isolation wasn't just about staying hidden, though. The beans had developed their own twisted way of surviving. They lived entirely off what they could steal from travelers, but that wasn't nearly enough to feed 45 people. Well, they found a solution to that problem, too. A rather stomach-turning solution that kept them well-fed and helped dispose of the evidence at the same time. The clan had turned their cave into something that would make a medieval butcher shop look like a fancy restaurant. They'd figured out ways to preserve their supplies for the lean times between attacks. But even the most careful predators eventually make mistakes. And when you're dealing with that many people in one family, someone's bound to get sloppy eventually. What the search parties would eventually discover in that cave would haunt Scotland for centuries. The truth about what happened inside that cave makes your worst nightmare look like a children's bedtime story. When searchers finally made their way through the narrow entrance during low tide, torches flickering against wet stone walls, they weren't prepared for what waited in the darkness. Human limbs dangled from the ceiling like some twisted butcher shop. Arms here, legs there, torsos hanging on makeshift hooks carved into the rock. The smell hit them first, rotting flesh mixed with salt air and something far worse. Makes you wonder how anyone managed to stay conscious long enough to document what they saw, right? But the hanging meat was just the beginning. Scattered across the cave floor were barrels, not filled with ale or grain like you'd expect from stolen goods. These containers held pickled human remains, carefully preserved body parts floating in brine like some horrific pantry. The beans had turned cannibalism into a science, storing their victims for future meals. Well, you'd think that was bad enough. The jewelry and clothing told another story entirely. Rings still attached to severed fingers, dresses torn and blood-stained, tossed carelessly among boots and belts. Each piece represented someone who never made it home. A merchant's gold watch, a farmer's work clothes, a woman's wedding ring. The beans kept everything, treating human belongings like trophies, and the weird part is how organized it all seemed. This wasn't random violence or desperate survival. The clan had developed a system. They'd strip victims of valuables, butcher the bodies with practiced efficiency, then preserve the meat for later consumption. 25 years of practice had made them terrifyingly good at it. The searchers found evidence of cooking areas deeper in the cave, fire pits blackened with use, crude spits for roasting, pots still containing unidentifiable stew. The beans had created their own twisted version of civilization, complete with meal planning and food storage. They'd feast on human flesh like other families shared Sunday dinner. Then there were the bones. Piles of them, gnawed clean and tossed aside. Skulls cracked open to get at the brains inside. Leg bones split for marrow. Nothing went to waste in the Bean household. They'd consumed every edible part of their victims, leaving only scattered remains as evidence of their crimes. Local bloodhounds had led the search party to this discovery. The dogs went crazy at the cave entrance, howling and refusing to go further. Smart animals knew something was very wrong inside. Their sensitive noses picked up scents that human searchers couldn't detect from outside, the overwhelming stench of death and decay that had built up over decades. But why had it taken so long to find them? The cave's entrance flooded twice daily with high tide, washing away tracks and scents. Perfect natural camouflage for the most horrific family secret in Scottish history. The men who made this gruesome discovery knew they'd found something that would haunt them forever. Yet their horror was nothing compared to what happened when the beans themselves were finally dragged from their underground hell into daylight. After 25 years of terror, the Bean clan made their biggest mistake. They got greedy. A married couple was traveling home on horseback one evening when the beans struck. But this time was different. The husband wasn't some helpless merchant or lone traveler. He was armed, experienced, and ready to fight back. When the grotesque family emerged from the shadows, expecting another easy meal, they found themselves in a real battle. The man fought like his life depended on it, because it did. His wife wasn't so lucky. The Beans managed to drag her down and began their horrific work right there on the road. But her husband kept swinging his sword, creating enough chaos to break free. He spurred his horse and rode hard toward the nearest town, leaving behind screams that would haunt him forever. Here's where things get interesting. The survivor didn't just report a robbery. He told authorities about a family of savage cannibals who looked barely human. Wild hair, filthy clothes, speaking in grunts and growls. Not exactly your typical highway robbers, right? Local officials finally connected the dots. All those missing people, the mysterious disappearances, the body parts washing up on shore, it all pointed to something far worse than anyone had imagined. The authorities sent word to King James VI himself. When the king heard the full story, he didn't hesitate. He gathered 400 men and a pack of bloodhounds for the hunt. Well, finding the Bean Cave wasn't easy, even with that many searchers. The coastline was riddled with caves, most of them flooded at high tide. The bloodhounds kept losing the scent near the water, but eventually they picked up something strong enough to follow deep into one particular cavern. The king's men had to time their entry perfectly with the tides. Too early or too late, and they'd be trapped or drowned. When they finally made it inside with their torches blazing, they found exactly what the survivor had described and much worse. The Beans were caught completely off guard. After decades of living like animals in their hidden lair, they suddenly found themselves surrounded by armed soldiers and snarling dogs. Makes sense they'd be shocked, right? They'd grown so confident in their secret location that they'd stopped being careful. But here's the strangest part. They didn't even try to fight. These people who had brutally murdered over 1,000 victims just stood there and surrendered. Maybe they realized their time was up, maybe they were too stunned to react. Or maybe, deep down, some part of them knew they deserved whatever was coming. The soldiers bound every single member of the clan, from the oldest adults down to the children. The evidence was overwhelming. Human remains everywhere, stolen goods piled high, the unmistakable stench of death and decay. King James VI looked around that cave of horrors and made a decision that would echo through Scottish history. The Bean clan's reign of terror was over, but their punishment would be something no one would ever forget. Justice in 16th century Scotland didn't mess around with paperwork. No trials, no lawyers arguing technicalities. The Bean clan's crimes spoke for themselves, and the punishment would match the horror they'd inflicted on over 1,000 victims. The men went first. They were dragged to the execution ground, where crowds gathered to witness something unprecedented. Their hands and feet were hacked off while they still breathed. Blood pooled in the dirt as they writhed in agony. The executioners weren't rushing tide. This was meant to be slow, painful, a spectacle that would burn into every witness's memory. But here's the twisted part. The Bean women and children watched it all happen. They didn't scream or beg for mercy. Instead, they hurled curses at their executioners, spitting venom even as their own deaths approached. 25 years of isolation had stripped away their humanity completely. Then came the women's turn. Along with the children, they were tied to stakes and burned alive. The flames licked higher as the crowd watched in grim satisfaction. These weren't innocent children caught in adult crimes. They'd participated in the cannibalism, helped dismember victims, lived off human flesh for decades. The authorities saw no distinction worth making. Well, you might wonder if anyone felt queasy about executing kids. Medieval justice operated on different principles. The Bean children had been raised as predators, knew no other way of life, and showed zero remorse. Society decided they were beyond salvation. The death toll tells the real story here. Over 1,000 people had vanished along that stretch of coastline. Entire families wiped out. Merchants who never made it home. Travelers whose bones were found pickled in barrels. The Bean clan had operated like a family business, except their product was death. Let's not forget the innocent innkeepers who'd been blamed for years. Some had been executed or driven from their homes, while the real killers feasted in their cave. The community's paranoia had claimed additional victims, adding another layer of tragedy to the Bean legacy. And the weird part is how quickly the cave was sealed and abandoned. Nobody wanted to go near that cursed place again. The entrance, hidden by tides twice daily, became a local landmark that people avoided. Fishermen changed their routes. The very rocks seemed tainted. The Bean story spread across Scotland like wildfire. Parents used it to warn children about straying from home. Travelers formed larger groups for protection. The tale grew with each telling, becoming more monstrous and unbelievable. But the core truth remained unchanged. A family had turned completely feral, preying on their own species for a quarter century. They'd created their own twisted kingdom, where human meat was dinner and murder was routine. Today, historians debate whether every detail actually happened. Maybe the numbers were exaggerated. Perhaps some elements got embellished over time. But something horrific definitely occurred in that Ayrshire cave. The Bean clan represents humanity's darkest potential. What happens when people completely abandon civilization and embrace their most savage instincts?